Hi everyone, my name is Juan Cicada and I'm the principal scientist at Data.World and co-host of Cataloging Cocktails, the honest, no BS, non-salesy data podcast. I'm excited to join the MIT CDOIQ Symposium and looking forward to having honest, no BS discussions about the data challenges that keep you up at night. At Data.World, we believe that when the world's data is transformed into knowledge, opportunities emerge for everyone. Looking forward to meeting you soon.
We are live.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to track 7, where we're discussing global challenges. Our track is running virtually. If you have any questions, please add your questions to the chat. We're gonna pick them up at the end. So I would love to introduce you the panel. The panel is gonna be focusing on external data. So which I think it's this topic is really close to the hearts of many of us, as we're going to be looking at big data, integrations between different ecosystems and partners, competitors. So many topics to go. So the leader for the panel is going to be Doug. So he's going to introduce his team. So Doug, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Elena. Great to be with everyone again. Really excited about this panel. We have a couple of really distinguished panelists to discuss the value and opportunities, challenges of external data. We have Mark Hookey, the CEO of DMIST, and Brad Schneider, the CEO of Nomad Data, joining us. A couple of organizations that are really pioneering the availability of external data assets. And myself, who has been kind of researching this, and I'll be presenting some findings tomorrow on how organizations are actually using data and whatnot, but I wanted to get kind of an insider's perspective from these two gentlemen today. Again, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A and we will address them as we go. But I want to introduce both Mark and Brad. So Mark, why don't you say hello, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about DMIST data and tell us how early it is where you are.
Thanks, Doug. And thanks, everybody. It's great to be here today. It's 5 a.m. here in Melbourne, Australia, bright and early. Very happy to be here. DMIST believes that external data is the next frontier of business impact. However, it's effectively locked away by complexity. And what we do is we provide a platform for external data operationalization. We take the complexity away out of deploying external data into business processes. We operate around the world and support banks, insurers, fintechs, insurtechs in their goals around tapping into the external data ecosystem.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mark. Good morning. Brad.
Great to meet everybody. Great to be here on this distinguished panel. Just to give you a quick background on Nomad Data. So we are also big believers that external data is going to revolutionize the way people make decisions in businesses, the way people drive features and products. And what we focus on is not necessarily helping you operationalize the data and get it in the door, but making sure you're getting the value from it. So connecting it to the business problems that are driving your need to even buy that data. So what can you do with it? Which challenges that you're facing are best served by which data sets. So we basically help you unlock the power of that data.
So folks can subscribe to Nomad Data to do what?
So if your firm wants to become more data driven and people across the firm have questions about competitors, about strategy, about potential growth of a market, but don't know which data can unlock that, that's really what our systems do. They help you unlock the data that you're buying and help you find new data sets to answer the very specific questions that the business lines have.
Okay, great. So kind of like a beyond just a Google for data sets, right?
Yeah, that's one piece of it, helping you find the data. But once you bring it in, how do you make sure your employees know that it exists in a way that ties it to the problems they have? So, half of the problem of external data is how do we get it in the door? Like physically, how do we ship those bits? How do we put them in that data warehouse? But once it's there, how do you actually empower your employees to do something with it? Most people are not technical enough to dig into a complex database. But if you show them that this data solves the problem they have, they could make that leap. And so we're enabling that bridge to be built.
Excellent, great. Excellent. So Mark, back over to you. And both of you definitely answer these questions. Let's talk about what are the different types of external data, and maybe some examples. And is there? I know there's different vernacular used, and we in the IT world and the data world love making up new terms for stuff. Is there really a difference between external data, alternative data, third-party data? Are they more or less synonymous? Does it really matter? And then again, what are some of the types of external data, and maybe some interesting examples?
Well, I think Brad touched on it already. One of the key issues with external data is awareness and discovery, and even knowing that the data exists. So from the lens of whether most business users and stakeholders know about external data sources and are able to match it to business problems, no, that I don't believe that there is a material difference. Those terms are synonymous. It is data outside an enterprise that may or may not be valuable for a given business problem. And there are business stakeholders that have a million things on and better things to do than scour the ecosystem and talk to thousands, if not tens of thousands of commercial data vendors in order to figure out whether or not there's a there there. Look, there's a very, very broad ecosystem from the big bureaus that contain credit information, business and consumer. There's property information, government records around building permits, court records, KYC information. There's information for capital markets, just a huge, huge diversity of information around potential macro indicators and company level indicators. Some of the things that DMIS tends to spend a lot of time on include things like risk information around businesses and people, alternative and traditional risk information, KYC checks, director checks. These are things that often enterprises are already using, but they're using them through some kind of a manual lookup. Maybe they've got a human analyst doing a lookup in a portal, and external data becomes the mechanism by which they tap into that. Now, we could all spend hours and hours and hours talking about the entire ecosystem, but that's some examples.
Okay, how do you classify different types of external data? Is there a kind of standard classification scheme?
Well, I think like many enterprises, we tend to look at it from two lenses. We look at it from the entity level, which is it information about a person, a business, a property, a drug, a stock, etc. Yeah. Regardless of what the business application is, it's the entity that's being modeled. And then the other lens is the use case, which we tend to think of as the business application. We try to increase conversion, reduce fraud, automate some back office process. Those we call them recipes at DMIS, but they're effectively use case applications.
Interesting. Okay. So I guess back over to you then, Brad. What are the different types of external data from your perspective? Maybe you categorize it or classify them a little differently, and maybe some of your favorite use cases.
Yeah, I mean, the categorization system itself, I think, confuses alternative external data, whatever you want to call it. And we get asked this question a lot. People will say, how many data sets do you have that cover India? And, that's a very vague question, right? Some data sets, what ends up happening is that they're global data sets, so they don't mention a specific country, or they were originally imagined for telco use cases, but they could just as easily be used for healthcare use cases. And so the classification system in some ways confuses what you can do with the data, because it kind of locks you into thinking that it can only be used for one specific thing. But I'd say generally the use case families that we're seeing a lot of, so in consulting, for example, and this is even true within companies, but a lot of people want to size markets. They want to understand markets, especially in times of economic uncertainty like right now. Is it my business losing share? Is it the economy that's shrinking or deals pushing? Without external data, it's really hard to see things like that. So those are very common questions. Then we also get a lot around sales use cases. So, we're a large telco, we're an insurance company. How many people like this that we want to sell to exist? Who are these people? These are very common use cases. And another big one is when thinking about getting into new markets. So companies want to size a market they might be looking to get into. We had a client looking to get into, insuring pleasure craft in an emerging market, and they wanted to know how many pleasure craft existed, what types of pleasure craft, what were the values of these crafts, and what did the insurance market look like. And so it's very hard to know where all these little niches of data live, and that's really where we're trying to add clarity.
Okay, great. Anything to add to that, Mark? You guys feel free to jump in whenever.
Well, I think an interesting lens is around external data versus internal data. What enterprises are building modern tech stacks and ways to have, the problems we talk about with external data, awareness, operationalization, orchestration, those problems exist for internal data as well. And it's a big domain that everybody's solving, and there's lots of people at this conference working on, and that's great. Somebody who's been a customer of an enterprise for years, my bank that I've had for a long time, knows a lot about me through the interactions between me and the bank. External data tends to be more useful, and the use cases tend to be more useful when they're about the outside world, when they're about new customers, when they're about profiling and automating and risk assessing, new to bank, new to insurer, new to telco, new to government, etc. In the case of immigration. And so we tend to think about the use cases that are about reaching out to customers outside the enterprise, and also the triaging and managing the inbound flow so that the customer has a seamless experience in engaging with that enterprise.
Yeah. So we discussed that for those who are curating external data, they may not be asking the right questions. How can we help them? How can those who are attending here learn to ask the right kinds of questions and get them to the kind of data that they really need more quickly?
Yeah, how do we help them boil the ocean? I think one key question that I'm coming back to is what data are they already using? But they're using it in some inefficient way or some siloed way. Many enterprises don't even have a register of the data that they currently purchase, or where they do, maybe they buy the same data 2 or 3 times.
No kidding. And we've helped companies rationalize their external data that they brought in, which part of the organization is using it, what are they paying for it, what kind of value are they getting from it. It's a complex exercise for a large organization.
Yeah, or maybe they're only using a couple of attributes from a given data source, and they're unaware of the other attributes. So starting with just what they're using today, and beyond that, it's more complicated. It's having workshops, educating people. I mean, we find that in general, you don't need the most brilliant data scientists in an enterprise to join the dots. People have great creativity when it comes to this stuff. I was talking with a bank a little while ago, and we just run education sessions where we just tell them what data exists, period. We don't even have to tell them the use case. So one of the elements that exists out there's about 5 different vendors that provide it, is what verified business is associated with someone's email address. mhookey@dmisdata.com means that I actually work at dmisdata.com. dmisdata.com is a registered domain. It's linked to a corporate entity. It's a verification. And then you just stop talking. People automatically join the dots and say, oh, okay, I could use that for verification. I could use it for income assessment. I could use it for fraud mitigation. I could use it for employee fraud mitigation. But they don't even know that there are vendors out there that have that one data element. And I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of those little vignettes. So there's nothing magical to it. It's just education. I mean,
so
maybe Nomad Data has something a bit more magical that you'd like to share, Brad.
Well, I was going to say, Brad, you seem to help organizations with just that question. Can you get into a little more detail?
We're big believers that you got to push people to stop trying to start with the data. I think this is one of the reasons this industry is somewhat broken. In no other industry do you start out with the answer and try to find the problem. But in data, it's all about the answers, the answers, the answers, the answers, and then we'll figure out what problem that it solves, which is backwards, right? We should start with the questions. Forget about data. What about your business that you're trying to improve? Are you having issues, verifying customers' credit and, evaluating fraud risk effectively? Start there, and then worry about what data exists. And so the service that we offer basically allows you to forget about all that stuff and focus on the business problem. Okay. And our service will translate it into the domain of data. And then I feel like people like Mark can help sort of set all that up for you, which is not really what we do, but we'll help translate the business problem into the domain of data. And once you do that, it actually becomes pretty simple. If you tell me your business problem and I show you a data set and tell you, here's how this data can solve that problem, most companies can figure out the rest, right? It's pretty deterministic. But going from, I need to track a certain kind of business with a certain kind of factory of a certain size, most people have no idea where to begin to find the data that could do that. But again, if you show it to them, they know the problem now, they know the data, they got smart people internally, they'll figure out how to produce the solution. That's more deterministic.
Yeah, I think Mark was also suggesting that there's an opportunistic way to kind of go about this as well, by showing them the art of the possible with data, and then that might lead to some new opportunities or innovations for them as well. Do you guys see that happening too?
I mean, I sometimes see people get confused when you show them like the new shiny object. They get too focused on the shiny object. And I mean, the amount of time we spend talking about satellite imagery versus the number of applications I've seen of satellite imagery, it's a pretty wide chasm. It's definitely fun and it's eye-opening, I think, to give these presentations, but at the end of the day, you got to focus on the business. Like, what are you trying to improve about your business? What are the problems in your business? Figure those out first. If you can't define what the problem is in your business and how you want to go after a new market, you're probably not spending your time wisely to be digging through data sets, right? I think that may be out of order a bit.
Okay. I'm suggesting it might be a bottom-up and a top-down approach, but you're seeing mostly that top-down approach focused on business problems.
We just see it working faster. Yeah, because for sure. The end business people are experts at their business. They know how to articulate the problems that they're seeing and what would be exciting if they had the right ingredients. Right. Asking them to become data scientists and data sourcing experts, I don't think that's a good use of their time. But once you give them those assets, then I think they can put it all together and assemble the vignettes that I think Mark is talking about.
So for an organization that is looking to hire a data curator, somebody who is heads up and aware of external data assets that might be valuable for particular business problems, this is where you can come in and help and fulfill that role, right?
Absolutely, but I do think having somebody run these initiatives internally is key, right? It's not just about bringing in a bunch of external vendors. You need somebody that's playing quarterback to make it work. If you don't have somebody who's business outcome is tied to the success of this overall, you're probably not going to have a good outcome.
Yeah, good. And so when we talk about the range of external data sources, I often break them down into 7 types of data: internal data, dark data. So those are both internal types of data. And then there's open data, social media content, partner data you can gather from partners or suppliers or customers, and then syndicated data, and then web content that can be harvested or collected. Are these all things that you track and have a purview into? And Mark, are these the types of data sources that you can provide a conduit into?
Yes, in our case, it includes also contributory data from bureaus, where it's effectively industry players sharing data with each other. And consent-based information is another broad category, where there's a mechanism by which the consumer is granting consent to access their own data for an enterprise, and we have connectors into all of those different data types, which get then operationalized into clients' data lakes, data systems, decision engines, production workflows.
Right. And would that include web content as well? I mean, you identify where web content can be harvested or where it's already been aggregated.
Yes, and there's more to it than the technical side of that around the specific connector. It's also the governance side to figure out what it can be used for. And this actually inextricably links to the use case and comments that we've been talking about, where people need to know what license rights or compliance constraints they have on different data sources. And as much as there's an awareness gap in the data itself and the business problems itself, there's also an awareness gap in what can and can't be done with given data sets. So all of the different categories you mentioned, and the different tagging of what can be used where in order to get external data out of the lab and into production. That's what our platform does.
Well, I want to get into some of the fun stuff, which is, how some of the, innovative and high value ways that organizations are using external data. And I really bummed that I can't be on site this week because I think some of you know, I just published a new book, so a little bit of an infomercial for the book Data Juice, which includes 100 examples of how organizations are using data and analytics, and probably most of them involve using some form of external data as well. So if you kind of want to be inspired, definitely pick up a copy of the book or reach out to me, and we can arrange to get you one. But from your perspective, working with companies around the world, I'd love to hear some of the more interesting stories about how organizations are using data, external data in innovative ways.
Brad, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we see a lot going on in the machine learning world. So we have a lot of customers that are looking for sort of real world annotated data sets to drive insurance models, drive investment models. I still think, as simple as it is, driving sales is still such an exciting use case. We work with one of the largest telcos in the world. They replace a certain 20-year-old piece of equipment, and they said, I wish there was a way to identify everyone in the US that was using this old piece of equipment. Yeah. And they take that into our system, and voila, there's a government procurement data set, because this is procured by public agencies, that it basically says exactly that, and they were just blown away. But it's so simple, right? They're just trying to come up with a customer list. But in a world where cookies are disappearing, in a world where there is so much data, it can be really challenging to figure out what data asset gives you that particular answer. But we see all different permutations of this, of people selling to consumers, of people selling to very niche businesses, of investors trying to size markets and understand how companies are performing, and even competitors trying to understand how each other are doing. Those are very exciting areas.
Okay. Sales is definitely a good group of use cases. Risk is another good group of use cases. Counterparty diligence and risk assessment, everything from fraud to KYC to credit risk to insurance risk to whatever the risk domain. Companies function on knowing who they're doing business with, and that's fundamentally a data question. How do I know who I'm doing business with? So some of the exciting use cases are around streamlining how an insurer finds out what type of small business they're dealing with. Is it a deli? Is it a nightclub? When are they open? How many employees do they have? Blue collar, white collar, etc. Consumers, do they have risk indicators? Are they on any watch lists around the world? Are there any red flags associated with being affiliated with shell companies? These are things people are already doing, and they're doing them manually, but they're things that are available in the external data ecosystem. And it's interesting in a way. There's a competition between external data and analytics and technology. And what I mean by that is all of these business problems we're talking about, the innovative business problems. I want to reduce fraud. I want to automate something. I want to sell more product. I want to, whatever. There's many ways to skin the cat, right? If I want to drive sales, there's many ways I could achieve that. I can bring in a consulting firm. I can do an internal consulting project. I can bring in an RPA firm and do automation. I can build some new Salesforce thing. I can go and spend my time on external data. And so there's a competition in terms of the attention of the executive around how do we skin the cat? How do we drive sales? What do we spend our time on? External data is just one of many options. Now, obviously, we're doing what we do because we think it's the silver bullet. We think it's this hugely efficient way to solve the business problem. But it's worth acknowledging and recognizing that it's the first challenge is making sure people are aware that this can be solved with data as opposed to something else.
Yeah, I'll share a couple of my favorite stories just quickly, and some of you may have heard these or read these before in Infonomics, but it's a great story from Walmart, which had a wonderful search engine, and it was helping people find what they were looking for online. And it was taking into account the 40+ million searches per month and all the product data and descriptions, and basically helping people, zero in on what they were looking for. But one week, folks were looking for a particular search term, and the word was house, and the search engine was taking them to housing goods and housewares and dog houses and doll houses. It wasn't at all what people were looking for. So maybe you can guess what it was they were looking for. It actually, the week of this search actually coincided with the season premiere of a particular television show, the show House, the medical drama. And what folks were looking for was the box DVD set of previous seasons. And so Walmart realized what their search engine wasn't taking into account was what was happening in the world. It's like social media was kind of staring at its own navel rather than being aware. So when they upgraded the search engine to include this external data on trends and kind of rescore the searches, they were able to reduce shopping cart abandonment by like 10 to 15% across the board. And I haven't done the math, but that's like $1 billion a year of sales for Walmart. Another fun story comes from Minute Maid, who's owned by Coca-Cola, and I heard the story about how I spoke to their CIO and how they get a call from a fast food company who is concerned that the quality of the orange juice is inconsistent season by season and region by region, because of vagaries in the supply chain and where the oranges are coming from at different times of the year. And so they were challenged to figure out a solution to this by this fast food company who said, we're gonna cancel our contract with you if you don't sort this out. And so they gathered all sorts of crop yield pressure. I think, Brad, you talked about satellite images, right? And cost pressures and multi-level supply chain data from partners, and bake this all into a precise dynamic formula for how to blend orange juice consistently, irrespective of the supply chain. And so now they can, if there's like a hurricane or a frost or a freeze or some disruption in the supply chain, they can replan the entire business in 5 to 10 minutes. So that's a really, really great example of them preserving a very large customer and achieving higher levels of consistency. So I remind people when you're drinking a glass of orange juice, remember you're drinking an algorithm. So, and drinking some external data as well. So
I think it's important to point out at both of your examples, there was a clear defined problem, and they went out and looked for data. And I think that's generally the formula that we've seen that's successful. Identify what you're trying to do first.
Yeah. Great. So let's see, what else do we want to cover here? So any other examples come to mind, you definitely jump in. I have a good question about like how much data is out there. So we talk about there being just this incredible array of external data. And I've heard that there are 10 million data sets published by government organizations around the world and 5,000 brokers of data out there. I mean, do you guys have any idea what the metrics look like for external data?
I mean, based on what, for a second, Mark, we've got about 1,300 data companies on our platform.
Wow.
I think there's about 10,000 out there, but the big trend that we're seeing is the shift of corporates that do something else as their primary source of revenue, starting to monetize data. And I mean, the rate of companies monetizing data is actually.
I definitely want to get to that topic as well and how you support them. Yeah.
So I mean, that's
yeah, it's definitely growing, and it's each of those companies often has many products. And another way to think about it is that many people aren't aware that a lot of the larger banks, insurers, healthcare providers, telcos, many of them spend low 9 figures per year on data. And that's not even just the biggest players. The biggest players will sometimes spend billions on data, and it's a big market. There's a lot of different data supply, and when this is not meant to be a bit of a plug, but just as a sort of a data point in terms of the data size, it should be 10 times bigger. So our average customer uses 10 times more data than our average non-customer, which is effectively, once you take out the friction associated with awareness and operationalization, the market, the consumption of data just expands. And so the market is artificially constrained. As big as it is and as varied and complex as it is, it should rationally be 10 times bigger.
Right. At some point, do we achieve like diminishing returns due to the reduced scarcity of data? I mean, we're basically just raising the bar, right?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's like, well, yes and no. I mean, yes, sure, there's only so many unique people and unique businesses and so on. And whether you profile them through social media or telcos or bureaus, or it's the same person. So there's diminishing returns due to that. But on the other side, you get more use cases. It's, you know, when friction came down for BI or AI or data warehousing, when it went from being this huge thing to not a big deal, it's not like people just said, oh, that's great, I'll do it cheaper, thank you. They did it more. They did it hundreds of times more, hundreds of thousands of times more.
And the vendors stepped in to reduce the friction, right?
Yeah. And so then, you know, external data, the ecosystem is stepping in to reduce the friction, and people will use it massively more in lots of other parts of the enterprise. And it won't just be 5 use cases per company, it'll be 5,000 per company. And so, no, there's not really diminishing returns.
Okay, good. And the market is so large, and there's so many different alternative data sources out there that you can be pretty clever in how in what you're using and how you're using it. There's a question in the chat here or on the panel on who is, so definitely everyone feel free to submit additional questions. This is one I wanted to get to around assuring the trust and quality of data that you're ingesting from a third party. You know, even if you know the data that you want for a particular business problem, this person asks, you know, we've done data quality assessments on the samples of the external data. This is done before making the final decision to purchase. So we can verify the data vendors providing what they promise and that the quality is good enough for what we needed to do. Do you see this happening very often? Are there some standard ways to go about ascertaining the validity, completeness, accuracy, timeliness, integrity, and so forth of data sources?
Yeah, we see it happening constantly with.
Good. I just lost you, Mark. Brad, can you jump in? I can't hear anymore.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear now.
Sorry. Yeah, happening a lot. And unlike walking into a retail shop and picking up the product and saying, does this look as advertised or not, I'll buy it. That's a 1 second purchase decision. Data takes 6 months sometimes to figure out, does it actually match and correlate to the right use case? And not just 6 months, but hundreds of thousands of dollars of expenses.
Right.
So it's a huge issue figuring out whether or not data has the right quality prior to making a purchase.
Yeah. Have you seen any standard methods for doing these assessments?
You know, fill rates, match rates, you know, all of the standard quality assessments, but also increasingly integration into AI systems so that people already have their predictive model trained in AWS SageMaker or DataIQ or Data Robot or some AI system. They've already got their business problem codified from internal data. And so the relevant business metric is, if I add a bunch of columns on from the outside world, does my model get better or not? And rather than a sort of general stat that is applicable to different data and different problems, the relevant stat is, does it add predictive value to a business problem?
So the proof is in the pudding rather than just simply analyzing intrinsically the quality characteristics of the data.
Yeah,
right?
Which is why inevitably we see a crawl, walk, run. Crawl is, look, I need to talk to a vendor or work with a platform like, you know, Nomad or Demist, and I need to just see 100 records and see a sample, see a match rate, understand whether it, you know, it's looks sensible. And then the walk is, well, I actually need to properly get a bunch of this information and figure out whether it's relevant and whether it works. And then the run is the operationalization. How do I get this into production?
Okay, right. Brad, did you have the thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, for every kind of data, there's a different way to sort of verify the validity. I mean, match rates are great for, you know, data to augment your CRM, for example. A common approach we see, a lot of our clients are trying to, again, understand a market or a competitor or something like that. So ground truth data is especially important. So if you're buying a data set where your company is actually somewhere in the data set. Maybe you're trying to track 100 companies in your industry. A great way is to actually take your real data and see what the purchase data looks like compared to what your actual data says. I used to use data to make investments in my prior life, and we would actually reach out to other companies to try to get their ground truth data. And it's kind of funny, but we had quite a few searches on the Nomad platform for ground truth data. So they're trying to track a certain thing in the world. They have a data set, but they need to tune it, and so they need the real number. We had somebody looking for tracking the actual attendance counts at baseball games or football games or concerts, because they wanted to correlate it and train the models they were building on another data set that they were creating. So ground truth for certain types of data sets, it makes sense if you can either find the data or you have the data.
And we one of the things that we have on our platform is these recipes I mentioned earlier, and that's really about what works in what situations. The metaphor kind of plays itself, and that's something that we in the industry is increasingly codifying, which is people aren't necessarily looking to retest this stuff. They just want to know what works. They want to go into the cereal box aisle and have a system that says buy this, buy this, buy this, because they work well together, and then you can optimize later on. And the barrier to entry has come way down, and what used to be a big project might just be, half an hour of playing around with one of these platforms to look at match rates and test things out, and then iterating on top and adding high quality information on top of that. So codifying those recipes and what works well together has been critical for our customers to help them accelerate their journey.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot and kind of assuming that most of the data that is licensed is raw data. Are there also increasingly data sets that are already kind of pre-filtered data or sliced data or analyses and reports, not just not just raw kind of transactional data? Do we see those as well? I mean, selling content, not just raw data.
I mean, to be honest, that's the bigger part of the data market from our perspective. There's so many niche reports. There's video files, audio files, so many things that don't fit in a database per se. And increasingly what we're seeing, again, people use the Nomad platform. They type in, I'm looking to answer this question or see this about a certain market. At the end of the day, do you really want a terabyte data set, right? If you just want to know market share of your computer by week, really an Excel spreadsheet that was correct would do the job. Sometimes that isn't available. But what we're seeing more and more is the data providers, when they know what you're trying to accomplish, they're starting to sell more or deliver more in these smaller bites, because it saves you so much time. You don't need a data warehouse and writing a bunch of code. It's basically, here's the answer. And obviously you need to come up with ways to feel comfortable that answer is true. But you don't necessarily want to do weeks and weeks of work to get to that answer.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it matches to many enterprises' hub and spoke structures as well. When we set up our platform inside enterprises, there's the centralized data teams that want raw, bulk streamed data, the full files of every consumer, every business, et cetera, because they increasingly need that to be able to have a single source of a reference file of truth about their customers. But then there's the spokes inside the enterprises that, as Brad said, they're just trying to solve one specific thing. They want their CRM pre-populated. They want their decision engine having a single record of information. Same ground truth underlying ecosystem that's out there, but different consumption patterns.
Okay. Who in the organization are the data buyers? So you talk about this hub and spoke kind of approach, but who like for the chief data officers and data and analytics leaders out here, who in the organization should kind of be responsible for curating and acquiring access to third-party data sources? Should this be their standard procurement function or something else? And what are you seeing in the real world?
Well, we're absolutely seeing an increasing centralization within the CDO group. In the large enough organizations that have a dedicated third-party data procurement person that lives within the CDO group, this absolutely is and should be within the control of the CDO function. Now, the business problems aren't always in the CDO function. So the business problems, the demand internally has to be aggregated from all of the different internal clients and users. But to meet all of the data quality, data governance, data compliance, the legal side of things, the data management and orchestration side of things. Those things increasingly, by definition, have to be centralized because it becomes impractical to do things like mapping provenance and lineage of third-party data, managing consent across all third-party data, meeting vendor licensing requirements across all third-party data. Those things have to be built centrally, and we're seeing that. It used to be more decentralized, but it's becoming more and more centralized, and regulators are in part driving some of that shift because they're asking CDOs the appropriate question of where did you get all of your data from in one
Right.
view.
What are the inputs to this algorithm? Right. Yeah.
We're seeing a mix of things. So a lot of functions make sense to be centralized. I think most of the ones Mark mentioned, but as Mark pointed out, the end user that has the problem is not the central data organization necessarily. So, you know, a lot of the platform that we have is about allowing that central data team to push an interface firm-wide to capture all those questions and sort of manage them at a firm level, but still have the end user involved. That we've seen a lot of problems where people try to overly centralize, and at the end of the day, the folks in the CDO org, they're not business line experts, so it may be very difficult for them to understand the complexities of the business problem, and so you have two different groups speaking two different languages, which doesn't help you solve the problem. So, you know, we're addressing that.
And not necessarily pull it, like, it's not just the CDO group and the business users. There's other groups as well. The CISO, who needs to govern it, the GC, who needs to ensure legal compliance, and often the CRO, who needs to manage the risk associated with leveraging third-party data. So all of these groups, there is no chief external data officer. There's just a chief data officer. Right. And so, you know, coordinating those functions is really hard for many enterprises to do. Yeah. So it has to sit somewhere.
So a lot of the discussions at this event are revolve around data governance. So how should we apply? Have you given some thought to, or do you advise your clients and customers on how to apply data governance to external data as well?
Yeah, that's a big part of why people are adopting platforms like this. Is they need centralized controls around things like access, centralized, you know, classification and cataloging, which is a big part of data governance. They need centralized data quality. All of these things that they need for internal data, they need it for external data as well. And external data has particular idiosyncrasies of how to do that. So data governance extends outside the enterprise because it's not good enough to say, well, I got it from TransUnion, I got it from Experian, et cetera, but where did they get it from? And where did they get it from? Right. Where did they get it from?
And what's the ultimate?
And why do I think I'm allowed to use it? What business application is this data set being used for, and how do I track and catalog and manage the access controls around external data?
Do you think we'll start to see blockchain used and smart contracts to track this sort of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, we, thought about it. It's many people think about having it because an immutable ledger of provenance makes sense in the context of data moving from enterprise A to enterprise B. I'm just, for sure, databases solve the same problem pretty effectively. I'm not sure that you necessarily need blockchain to be able to rigorously track where data came from and went to. We are seeing there are a lot more of these privacy enhancing technologies that are coming out that allow people to get value out of data without necessarily moving it. That's a pretty interesting domain where people are bringing analytics to the data rather than data to the analytics, and that's going across boundaries. Drawing those insights and building models without necessarily shifting terabytes of sensitive data from point A to point B. Right. I think that's a bit more of a fertile innovation ground than blockchain.
Absolutely. I wrote about that in Infonomics, about how a particular data provider, rather than publishing data out, was requiring or encouraging their customers to come to their own platform to use the data. Bring your own tools, bring your own data, integrate it, play with it on our platform. And in that way, this data provider can now see how folks are using the data to provide more packaged specific data solutions. And it also kind of prevents data from getting out there in the wild, more so than usual, which kind of gets us to the question on contracts and licensing. What have you seen in how external data is licensed, and what advice would you give kind of our audience here on what to make sure to look for and include or try to exclude in their licensing agreements?
Yeah, that's a big question, and we do a lot of vendor certification for our clients effectively they don't have to contract with the supplier if they don't want it. Still transparent, but it's more of like a Whole Foods model. Whole Foods doesn't own the farm, but they take responsibility for the produce being sold. And I use the food analogy deliberately because it's this sensitive resource you're ingesting and you need to know where it came from. Now, certifying a data vendor requires knowing where it came from, knowing what rights it comes with, knowing why they think that you have the rights, knowing they have network security processes in place, they have business processes in place for things like disaster recovery and business continuity planning. There's no one silver bullet. It's all of the different checkpoints you have to do to work with an appropriate counterparty and supplier. The only thing we would, and obviously we're biased, strongly recommend is it doesn't make any sense for every enterprise to do that for every data source. It's just a hugely wasteful mechanism. It's there are platforms like us and others out there that are increasingly stepping in the middle and saying, we'll take responsibility for the certification of this data supply.
Okay, excellent. Anything, Brad, from your perspective, you're seeing contract-wise? I know you're a little bit more removed from that, but
I mean, the main thing we see is pricing, and I've just seen more flexibility around pricing models. But I think before, everybody had been trying to sell you their most expensive license, 1 year subscription to everything.
right.
I think as we reduce friction in the market and volumes are increasing, we're seeing people price in ways that fit better with business problems, which I think will further accelerate adoption of data because it's been messy, I think, the last decade or so.
I'd add on to that. Well, I'd add on to that, a lot of the enterprises we're seeing get a lot out of this is if you separate the kind of the exploration testing phase from the operationalization kind of at scale phase, like people can negotiate very big, well-negotiated deals for the stuff once they know it's really, there's a there. But for the testing phase, many of the enterprises that get the most out of the ecosystem, they're very clear about their business problem. They communicate out the test they're doing. They even set up sandboxes sometimes, as you mentioned, Doug. And they say, hey, industry, have at it. This is exactly what we're solving for. Throw your data into the sandbox. We'll pay $1,000 fee. They standardize, they push themselves to being a price setter versus a price taker. And that way they can test 50 sources rather than 2. And vendors are usually pretty open to that because they've got a huge cost of sale and they've got, incredibly complex processes as well. And they don't want to deal with the cost of it.
Thanks. Excellent. Let's turn the tables. Let's talk about how organizations can and should or might be externalizing their own data, monetizing their own data externally, and how does that work? What are some best practices around that, and is there really kind of an imperative to do so?
I mean, we're definitely seeing an of interest in that area. I think the struggle that a lot of people have is they put the cart before the horse. So they get super excited. They want to start speaking with customers, but they haven't even spoken with their own internal legal and compliance and even figured out what they're comfortable selling. So we see things starting out of order very often. And also, I think understanding what your data is actually worth is a really important thing to do probably before having any of these conversations. We've spoken with a bunch of corporates that have data that, at least from our point of view, doesn't seem particularly interesting, but they think because they're a big company that it's worth, millions of dollars per user. That isn't always the case. And then we have, certainly some companies where we see that don't think their value is valuable, their data is that valuable, and it's literally the holy grail. Everyone's been looking for it, and they don't know that. And so that's one of the first steps is really, what is this worth? Speaking with people who would be buyers, understanding what people would be willing to pay before going through that, painfully complex process.
So they can reach out to you to help with this kind of assessment?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking to data companies and buyers, and we know why they're buying, what they're paying. So it's certainly something that we can help with.
Yeah, I know at West Monroe, we do data valuations and do external data market assessments as well. So, yeah. Mark, your perspective?
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit contrarian on this. Is it, what's it worth? Part of that is it truly scarce? Is it Schumpeterian rent or a Ricardian rent? Is it actually the only way to figure out something? And most use cases, no, absolutely not. Most use cases, somebody will be like, I want to sell my data, and there's actually already 23 well-established vendors that not only have the data, but they're in the business of data monetization. It's not something to be taken lightly. An enterprise can't just say, oh, I'll open up an API and I've got my data set already, so therefore I'm a data vendor. Well, no, there's governance, sales, marketing, there's regulatory matters that. So in most situations, we don't think that it's called for. We think that the market, the ecosystem, already has lots of different supply that is being unconsumed. We're living in a pre-Netflix world, right? We've got way too much content. There's no app, there's no distribution where somebody can binge, and that's what we're solving for. But why manufacture new data products when the market doesn't need them? Now, there are exceptions to that, truly proprietary data assets between partners or in the healthcare space where people have to manufacture the data for certain use cases. But most of the time that there's already supply out there.
Yeah. Brad, how much of your the kind of the queries that folks submit end up leading them down the path of looking at some non-data broker data, like data that's available from another commercial organization?
In our case, it's quite a bit, because I guess the problem, with even this discussion is like the data world is so much bigger than any of us really see. We all live in our little corners of it, and each part of it is so different. So we live in this world where we get such insanely specific questions. Like we ended up reaching out to a whole bunch of language schools this week to recruit them as data sellers. And you would think, well, what data do they have? Well, actually, we have a client looking for conversational audio files with really high quality, not really transcription, but like word for word proofread transcripts. That is not a big market, right? And they have very unique data for that particular use case. And so what we see is these use cases will become in vogue, and then all of a sudden, a set of companies, their data becomes extremely valuable at that point in time, or maybe it's just for that one query. But I think a lot of companies have unique things. I think, Mark, to your point, are they broadly interesting? No, absolutely not. But we certainly see, the scarcity angle is important, and we do see companies at least possessing data that is very scarce. Whether they can actually get over the line of monetizing it is always a question. The partner-to-partner data is the most interesting, but I think a lot are restricted. But we've talked to some large QSR, quick service restaurants, that are looking at selling their partner data, right? Because they're on the buying side. They see what they're paying for all these different, food prices. And there's a big question right now about what's going on with food prices. And it's not like their suppliers are going to stop selling to them. They have no choice. And so they're looking to make some extra money. And that's, an area of interest. There's shockingly little pricing information in certain markets.
So it sounds like Nomad Data is connecting buyers and sellers, right, as well, or finding buyers for sellers, finding sellers for buyers as well, right?
Yeah, so we do that externally, so helping people outside the firm, but the same problem exists once you buy the data, right? Let's say you bought every data set on the planet. You'd have the exact same problem. Which data do I use to solve which problem? So internal or external doesn't really matter.
So if I want to test the market, let's say I've got some data I think might be valuable, I want to test the market, can I list it on either of your sites? How would that work?
Yeah, I'll go first. We're not a list. We're a search platform. So you would come to us. We would basically add you to the platform. We do marketing with new partners as well to sort of generate interest in their use cases, and we sort of advertise the use case, and then we sort of see who bites. It's an interesting use case.
And then no access to sample data through your platform, right? That would be from the data provider.
You can respond with sample data, but we're not like a database per se. We're not doing what Mark's doing.
Yeah. Okay. Mark, why don't you click?
Yeah, that's possible for net new data suppliers to list full files and APIs on our platform, and we don't tend to, we tend to see a lot more traction and success in areas where enterprises already kind of know what data they're looking to deploy and operationalize, whether they've tested it from the vendor, or they've dabbled around on Snowflake or Amazon or us or Nomad or somewhere else, and they kind of know what they're trying to achieve. Which might just be, looking at a couple of spreadsheets and PDF brochures before they kind of get into that point. But once they know what they're trying to achieve, that's where our platform tends to add the most value around operationalization. Right. The data monetization piece is interesting. It becomes, do enterprises, are they really going to make a lot of money from it? Depends on the use case. Often I once spoke to the second in charge of a very large telco about data monetization, and we'd already pre-sold their data to a few large banks, fairly big contract sizes, because the banks wanted the telco data for risk assessment. And the telco 2IC said, look, Mark, this is interesting, but I've got a multi-billion-dollar EBITDA. It's too complicated, for 7 or 8 figures of rev share. If you can help me do sell more postpaid phones, or set up my telco towers in a better place, or run my back office, those are 8-9 figure value props. Do those. Yeah. Help me bring more data in and use my own data. Don't help me get data out. That's just an example of the questions people have to ask before they start listing and selling their data.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, listen, we're running up on time here. I think we've addressed all the questions. I want to thank you both for joining the chat. Mark, Brad, why don't you, I don't know if you want to put it in Zoom, or just also tell everyone how they can kind of get in touch with you and your companies.
Sure. For us, reach out at demist.com, demystify, so demist.com. We'd love to chat to anybody about external data operationalization and external data governance, and how to do external data governance. And everybody should buy Data Juice as well. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you. There it is.
And to reach out to us, we're just at nomad, nomad-data.com. And so we're really here to help figure out how to plug data into your processes in terms of which data is going to help drive positive outcomes for the business.
Great. And for anybody who's interested in going through the process of ideation around data monetization, generating ideas, testing their feasibility, developing out data products, whether they're internal or external, definitely reach out to me at West Monroe. So thanks everyone for attending. Gentlemen, thank you again, and everyone have a great rest of the event. Cheers.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.